Well, welcome back, friends, to our study of the Gospel of Matthew. Sorry I couldn't be with you last week, but this week we're going to get right back into our study. We're in chapter 11. We're ending chapter 11 and beginning with chapter 12. Chapter 11 contains some pretty harsh teaching from Jesus, really getting on to some of his audience. And then it contains a very gentle, loving invitation to basically everyone. And then in chapter 12, we start on a series of conflict stories between Jesus and the religious political leaders of the time, the Pharisees and teachers of the law, as they're described in Matthew. So that's kind of an overview of where we're going today. Looking back, though, at where we ended last time, we'd like to take a look at chapter 11 in Matthew, starting about verse 20. So what I'd like to do here is to share this screen with you, and then bring in a window that contains the scriptures for today, if we can do it that way. So 11 chapter 20, we get into a section where there are 6 cities that are named. Jesus began to denounce the towns in which most of his miracles had been performed because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be lifted up to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades. For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. But I tell you that it will be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. A couple of things here that we really should pay attention to in this section. First of all, it's pretty clear that Jesus believed in a day of judgment. He believed in punishment for the wicked and reward for the righteous. That seems clear. The other thing is that Jesus teaches that with opportunity comes responsibility. He said, these horrible pagan cities, Tyre and Sidon, they're along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, modern day Lebanon. I think Tyre or Sidon, I forget which, archaeologists have decided that this is one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in the world. Very, very old culture, but you know how seaport towns are. You know how New Orleans is. It was a place where literally anything goes. And the fact that it was a seaport, very cosmopolitan, and a strong pagan culture, both of these towns, both of these cities, Tyre and Sidon. Then Sodom, condemned, frankly, for a number of things, but homosexuality in the Old Testament, and God rained down fire from heaven in the book of Genesis. And Jesus is saying, if these places, if these people had the opportunity that you, people of Galilee, have had to be around me, to listen to my teaching, to see my miracles, then they would have repented. And so justice demands that you be judged more harshly. Well, this is certainly sobering for those of us who have had unlimited opportunities, essentially, to study the Bible and to be exposed to Christian faith. Then after this rather strong teaching, we move into the latter part of chapter 11, and it says, at that time Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. This, I think, is very interesting because it starts off with one of Jesus' prayers, and he acknowledges God's superiority, authority, and providence, but he thanks and praises God for revealing these things to little children and hiding them from the wise and learned. So who are these little children? We we know there are places in the Bible where Jesus says, let people bring their children to me. We haven't seen that yet. In Matthew, there's a place that we're going to see where he says, unless you become like little children, you won't enter the kingdom. But the idea of Jesus interacting with children, teaching children, we haven't seen that yet. And so what's he talking about here? I'd like to suggest that Jesus very tenderly referred to his disciples and people that humbly came to him for help as little children. In chapter 9, verse 2, the paralyzed man, he calls him son. A little bit further down in chapter 9, verse 22, he calls the woman with the flow of blood that touched the hem of his garment, daughter. And then in chapter 10, verse 42, that whole speech about the cost of discipleship, at the end, he says, people that help my disciples, they're going to be favored by God. If you give a cup of water to one of these little ones. And so Jesus very tenderly refers to his disciples as children, as little ones. And he is happy. He praises God for revealing himself to the poor in spirit, to the childlike, not to those who are powerful, mighty, cunning, wise, learned, but to the poor in spirit, to the little children. A great lesson for us to keep in mind in our approach to the scriptures. And then he issues this beautiful invitation, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. Take my yoke and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We know that a yoke is like a wooden bar device that's put around the neck of a beast of burden, an ox or a mule or something. And it's I guess kind of like a horse collar. We used to talk about horse collars. And it helps this animal, helps us to use the animal to pull a load. In similar way, a well-designed backpack that a person uses to carry a heavy load is something like a yoke. And in first century times, when a person wanted to be a disciple of a particular teacher, a particular rabbi, it was referred to as bearing the yoke of that leader, of that teacher. And so Jesus is inviting people to come and enroll in his course of discipleship, to submit themselves to the discipline of being a disciple. And at this time when we're coming out of the pandemic, and many of us have had frankly, out of necessity, a much more casual approach to the church assembly, to being involved in church, it's time for us to think about putting that yoke back on in a way. Jesus invites people who are weary and burdened to come. He doesn't invite those who are feeling just fine. He was criticized when he went to the dinner party at Matthew's house. He said, why are you eating with all these tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus said, well, people that are well don't need a doctor. I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And so he calls here to people that are weary and burdened. It says that in chapter 9, verse 36, he looked out and saw the multitudes, and to him they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd, And so we see the mercy, and Jesus, of course, talks about mercy in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the merciful, for they will obtain mercy. And he demonstrates this. He says, I am a humble and gentle in heart. That word gentle is the same word that's used in the Beatitude, where it says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the gentle. And you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And I got to tell you, I have some trouble with that last verse. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself daily and take up his cross and follow me. I don't find the cross to be an easy burden a lot of times. And, I think that there's a physical, financial burden to being a Christian, but there's also an emotional burden. And in many ways, when we answer the call to come follow Jesus, we answer a call to have a broken heart. We answer a call to come and have a broken heart. And struggling through this, discussing it, thinking about it, discussing it with my friend Matthias this week, I think maybe the way that this burden is light and this yoke is easy is in comparison to the burden and the yoke we bear if we decide to serve Satan. Because as the old song says, you got to serve somebody. And this is really borne out in Romans 6, Romans 8, that we can be servants of righteousness or we can be slaves to sin, and it's up to us which one we choose and which burden we choose to bear. Well, that brings us to chapter 12, and you see that on your screen. So let's just read this first, I'm going to call it conflict story. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? Now listen to this. I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Okay, let's make sure that we have the setting for this story well in mind. Jesus and his disciples on the Sabbath day are walking past or through a grain field. And in the Old Testament, it says, if you're walking through your neighbor's field and there's something to eat, put out your hand, pick it and eat it. That's fine. That's good. Just don't bring a bag or bundle or a scythe to cut his grain. Don't take advantage of the situation. And also it instructs landowners. It says, when you harvest your crop, leave some over there in the corners or by the side of the road. People that come by, they can get a little something. The foreigners, the poor people, the travelers, the homeless, they'll have something to pick. And a great example of this gleaning, as we call it, in the book of Ruth. The issue is not that they're doing this. The issue is that they're doing this on the Sabbath day. Now, I want to make sure that we have in mind that this is not just fast food. It's not just snacking like we do constantly between meals. They're really hungry, okay? And they're somewhat destitute following Jesus. And so this is what they have for their food at that point in time. And Jesus, he condemns the lack of empathy on the part of his Pharisee critics. What's the basis of their criticism? Well, the basis of their criticism is that their rules, not the Old Testament law now, but their rules had decreed that this sort of activity was work. Now, if you're at home, you have food in a bowl or container, you can put it in your mouth. But if you're in a field and you reach out and pick it and then put it in your mouth, that's work. You're not supposed to do that. Whole tradition, the whole social order breaks down if we allow work on the Sabbath. Now, Jesus could have replied to them by saying, well, technically speaking, you're wrong. This isn't work per se. Instead, he takes a completely different tack. He said, in certain situations, greater priority can be given to meeting a physical need than to meeting religious law. And he mentions the example of David, the great Old Testament king. Now, David and his companions, Jesus and his disciples, Jesus, son of David, Messiah. This is kind of an explosive illustration, but Jesus uses it. And basically he's saying, you Pharisees don't condemn David, so why would you condemn me for this sort of thing, me and my companions? The second one is that he says, the priests, they work on the Sabbath day. They, all kill animals and make fires and burn incense. They do all this stuff and this work, but you don't condemn them. And then he says something that's really explosive. He says, one greater than the temple is here. It's hard for us to understand how sacred the temple is. It's not anything like a church building. In fact, you can read the entire Bible. There's no reference whatsoever to any Christian church building that I know of. There are a couple of cases where they used buildings, but as far as the church congregation building or owning a building, it's not there. Lots of references to them meeting in public places and in homes. Okay, so, but in the Jewish religion, the temple where the Holy of Holies was, and the Ark of the Covenant, the Shekinah, God's presence on earth, it was the holiest place of all. And when Jesus says one greater than the temple is here, that's explosive. And then he says, he goes back to something that he's quoted earlier in the story about, I've already mentioned Matthew. They said, what are you doing eating with us? He says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, Hosea 6:6. So he brings this verse up again. And he indicts the Pharisees for their lack of mercy. So that's kind of his response here. This threefold response: the example of David, the example of the priest, and the words of Hosea. Two great claims about himself, greater than the temple, and then he says, "For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Some people have read that and they said, well, there are places where Jewish religious leaders said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And Jesus is saying the same thing here, but I don't think so. I think the Son of Man is again a reference to Jesus and his role as Messiah, his divinity. And he's saying the Son of Man is the Lord. If I say it's okay on the Sabbath, it's okay on the Sabbath. So he's again making an astounding claim about himself. Well, that same day, it seems like Jesus, most people would say, well, maybe we ought to tiptoe around this Sabbath thing. These Pharisees, they don't like it. It's making them mad. But instead, Jesus takes it head on. And so let me, if you don't mind, share my screen again. And we'll just get right back to where we were before. So we're going to see if I can make this work out. Okay, so then it says down here, going on from that place, this is verse 9 of chapter 12. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogues. Now, who is there? And I think from the context, we'll see that it is talking about some of the local religious leaders, Pharisees, and teachers of the law. And a man with a shriveled hand was there, a guy who's, nerve damage. He's lost the use of his hand, and it's atrophied. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they ask him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now, it's important that we get the full import of the phrase to bring charges against Jesus. We love the fact, and I love the fact, to the truth, in our country, we have something called separation of church and state. And so the regulations, the rules, the governance, if you will, of any religious group is totally different and separate and apart from the laws that regulate our lives as citizens. The church doesn't tell you what the speed limit is. They don't tell you how much it costs to buy a license to do whatever it is you need to do. They don't regulate, public health questions or crime. And it's just, that's the churches deal with primarily with morality, and the government deals with other issues. But back then it was the same thing, okay? And so they're interested in bringing charges against him. They ask him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Again, is this work or not? He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? how much more valuable then is a person than a sheep. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Not, for example, to make a plot on how to catch somebody else. It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath, not to do evil. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Kill Jesus. These are not nice people. And so this is, here we are, chapter 12, not quite halfway through the book, and we already see that Jesus' enemies are making concrete plans to, to kill him. Now, why would they do that? You know, again, we don't really understand how you could have a conflict about religion that would lead someone to kill somebody else. I know it happens in certain parts of our world today. I have differences of opinion with over religion with lots of people. Some of these are small differences, some of them are big differences. I never wanted to kill anybody over it, though. But these guys see a threat to their own power, their own position, their own prestige. There's a certain amount of envy over Jesus' popularity, and so therefore they must kill him. Now, when we read these stories, you know, it's obvious that the Pharisees are wearing the black hats. They're the bad guys. And Jesus and his disciples are the good guys. And so when we read it, we say, yeah, if I'd been there, I would have been on Jesus' side. I'm one of his followers. And those bad old Pharisees, we just can't wait for them to get it. Sooner or later, we know that the villains, you know, we in reading this story, it probably does us more good to kind of put ourselves under the black hats, to kind of see what do we have in common with these Pharisees. Jesus makes a much more argument here, and this is very common in the teaching of the rabbis of his day. It's very common. Jesus uses this an awful lot in his teaching, and that is if he proves that something is much greater than something else, then the in between is a lot easier to handle. And so he said, you know, a man is much more valuable than a sheep. So if you help a sheep on the Sabbath day, you're surely going to help a man, right? Modern day Americans need to listen to this. Jesus told his disciples, I think back in chapter 10, you are more value than many sparrows. Our modern culture has gotten confused about the value of human beings that are made in the image of God and the value of animals. I love the animals in my house. Okay, we go crazy over them. We have pets. We take care of them. We baby them. They live the life of ease. I'm telling you. But I hope that at the end of the day, we have more compassion, and it shows up in our bank account for people in need than for our animal friends. At any rate, Jesus makes a compelling argument here because evidently by their own rules and laws and what have you, the Pharisees would indeed help an animal in distress on the Sabbath day. It says they're making a plot to kill him. And so the very next verse, which we didn't read, but it says Jesus withdrew from that place. And this is where we'll begin a study next time of what I'm going to call the quiet Messiah. But I want to go back to something I mentioned about these conflict stories between Jesus and the Pharisees, and what do they mean to us today? So some people read these stories and they say, aha, these stories indicate that being a stickler for details of religious doctrine is hypocritical, is pharisaical. You should never do it. And whatever someone else chooses to do to worship God, whether it's to paint their body with red paint and dance around, play an electric guitar, burn candles and incense, have priestesses recite poems or whatever they want to do, that should be just fine. Don't criticize someone else's approach to religion. I think when we look at Jesus' life as a whole, though, we find that he was a pretty careful observer of the law of Moses, and someone said he's the only one that ever kept the law perfectly. But I think as a key to kind of unlock this mystery of what does this all mean, we should go back to the Sermon on the Mount. And you know how it begins. It begins with the Beatitudes, where Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He talks about about 7 or 8 qualities that really make a person blessed, you're to be congratulated if you have this. It puts you in a good place with God. It puts you in a good place with God. So when we look at those, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek or the gentle. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. And then we compare that with the attitude and actions of the Pharisees in these 2 conflict stories. It comes into focus. It comes into sharp relief. Because instead of viewing the Old Testament law as a guide, as something to lead them close to God and make them continuously aware of his presence in their life and their covenant with him, instead, the law has become a way for them to control other people, a way for them to hold the line on their tradition, their prestige, their power. And these poor, ignorant people who don't have enough to eat, well, let's get tough on them. The enforcement of religious regulation, it seems to me, is almost entirely external here and not looking at oneself. And so I think there's a really great lesson for us here, that the condemnation of the Pharisees is not because they were trying to be scrupulous about the law, but because they so severely lack the qualities that we read about in the Beatitudes. Well, you could be really happy that this guy with the shriveled hand can use his hand again, right? Let's throw a party. Isn't this the greatest thing? This poor guy, he can use his hand again. Or you can say, we don't like this. We're not happy. Let's go out and kill Jesus. Let's figure out a way to do it to him. It's really up to us. Well, that's where we stop for today. Thank you so much for joining again in this great study. Next week, we'll continue in chapter 12. And I hope before too many more weeks, we can continue to, by studying this class, we can meet this class in person at the Oxford Church of Christ at 9 a.m. on Sunday mornings. So we'll kind of look to our elders and get some guidance on how that's going to happen. But I'm hoping a few weeks, few months that's going to happen. We are earnestly looking forward and praying for that day. So thank you for being with me today.